The city pulsed with its usual nighttime rhythm, headlights flickering like fireflies. Neon lights casting their cold glow across brick and concrete. Somewhere on a side street, beneath a street lamp's indifferent glare, Jalen Adams walked alone, his mind replaying the laughter and conversations of the evening, still lingering in his head like an echo. It had been a long week, and tonight was his one chance to relax with friends, to feel free, unburdened. But even as he laughed with them, a faint shadow of caution never left him. Turning onto a quieter street, he spotted a flash of blue and red lights behind him. His heart tightened instinctively, a reaction he knew well. But he was doing nothing wrong, just walking home. His hands visible, shoulders straight. He knew the drill. Still, when the police cruiser rolled up alongside him, and 2 officers stepped out, he felt that familiar grip of apprehension close around him. "Hey! You there," called one of the officers, his voice sharp as a blade cutting through the still night air. Jalen stopped, took a deep breath, and turned. "Yes, sir?" The older officer, James Turner, eyed him critically, his gaze like a weight pressing down. The younger officer, Samuel Reed, stood just behind Turner, his face unreadable but tense, as if still learning the ropes of intimidation. "Did you not see the pedestrian crossing light back there?" Turner asked, his voice laced with a trace of accusation. "Jaywalking. Huh? Or are you too good for the rules?" Jalen hesitated. Jaywalking? He knew he'd crossed carefully, only a few paces away from the corner. It wasn't as though he had dashed into traffic or caused a scene. But he sensed where this was going, and he knew better than to argue. "My apologies, officer. I wasn't aware," he replied, his tone steady but respectful. He kept his gaze low, not out of fear, but out of caution, out of survival. But his measured answer seemed to irk Turner more. The officer's eyes narrowed, a flicker of disdain crossing his face. "You weren't aware?" Turner sneered. "You think you're smart. Huh? Just taking a little midnight stroll. Are we?" Jalen swallowed, feeling the simmering heat of injustice start to boil beneath his calm exterior. But he fought it down. Reacting would only make things worse. He'd seen enough friends, enough cousins, get caught in these small traps that seemed insignificant but held sharp, unseen teeth. "I'm just trying to get home, officer," he said, his voice carefully even. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive, before Turner spoke again. "Let's see some ID." He took a step forward, already reaching out as though expecting Jalen to resist. Jalen fumbled with his wallet, trying to keep his hands slow, visible. He passed his ID to Turner, who snatched it with a grunt, eyeing it like he was looking for something, anything, that would confirm his own suspicions. Behind him, Reed shifted, his gaze flicking between Jalen and Turner. There was a faint tension in Reed's stance, as though he sensed this wasn't right but didn't dare step out of line. He'd joined the force with hopes of helping people, of protecting his community. But nights like these made him question everything. Turner handed back Jalen's ID, his eyes lingering on him. And then, like a switch flipping, his expression hardened. "Why don't you come with us?" he said, gesturing to the cruiser. Jalen blinked, his stomach tightening. "With all due respect, sir, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm just trying to get home." The officer's lips curled into a hard, humorless smile. "Oh, you're just trying to get home?" His voice dripped with mockery. "What? You think you're above the law? Just because you're a good little kid? Huh?" The words stung, striking something deep inside him. The mask of calm slipped for a fraction of a second as he looked up, a spark of defiance flaring in his eyes. Is there a reason I'm being stopped, officer? The question was a risk. One he knew could change the course of the night. But the need for some semblance of dignity pushed him forward. He had done nothing wrong. He had a right to ask. Turner's jaw clenched, his hand tightening around the edge of his belt. You want to play it that way? Fine. And before Jalen could respond, Turner moved, his hand pressing into Jalen's shoulder with a force that sent him stumbling back. In that split second, everything went silent in Jalen's mind, a ringing filling his ears as he braced himself, instinctively putting his hands up. Whoa, wait. I didn't do anything. Jalen's voice cracked, the desperation threading through his words. But his plea only seemed to fuel Turner's aggression. Hands on the hood. Now! Turner barked, forcing Jalen against the cruiser, the metal cold against his cheek. His hands twisted Jalen's arms behind his back with an almost practiced efficiency. Reed looked on, his face paling. He wanted to intervene, to say that this was too far. But he stayed rooted, paralyzed by the weight of authority and duty. A small voice in his mind whispered that this wasn't right. But louder voices told him to fall in line, to not question his partner. Jalen's vision blurred, his chest heaving. He was being treated like a criminal, like something less than human. The injustice of it burned. But he was powerless against it. Just another victim to be processed and forgotten. As Turner finally released him and shoved him into the back of the cruiser, Jalen sat in stunned silence, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He hadn't wanted this fight, he'd done everything he could to avoid it. But now, as the cruiser sped down the street, the city lights blurring outside the window, a grim realization settled over him. He wasn't going to let this go quietly. And as he sat there, bruised but unbroken, neither Turner nor Reed had the faintest idea of the storm that would follow this night, the truth of who Jalen was, and the consequences of their choices. The city was restless, bathed in the cold blue glow of streetlights as midnight settled in. The sounds of distant cars, the hum of nightlife, and the occasional chatter of people drifted down the empty street. Jalen Adams walked alone, his steps calm and steady, the evening air cool against his skin. In the quiet of the night, he felt a rare moment of peace. It had been a long day, and tonight was his escape, a chance to laugh, to forget, even just for a while, that there were eyes always watching him, expecting him to slip up. As he turned onto a quieter street, a faint vibration buzzed from his pocket. Pulling out his phone, he read a quick text from his mom, "Be safe, son." He smiled, tucking the phone away. She worried about him every time he went out at night. The streets are no place for a black boy to be alone, she'd told him countless times. He didn't understand it when he was younger, but he did now. A sudden flash of blue and red lights cut across the street, shattering the quiet. His stomach clenched, a reflex he'd developed over years. Even though he had done nothing wrong, those lights meant something else to him. Something other than safety. A police cruiser pulled up beside him, its headlights illuminating him as if he were caught in a spotlight. Two officers stepped out, their shadows stretching across the pavement, sharp and imposing. The first officer, tall and broad, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, approached with slow, deliberate steps. His eyes narrowed, studying Jalen with a gaze that felt as cold as the night air. This was Officer James Turner, a seasoned cop with decades on the force. A man whose patience with what he deemed as troublemakers had long worn thin. Beside him stood Officer Samuel Reed, A younger man with an air of nervous energy. Still new to the weight of his badge. Jalen's heart raced. His hands instinctively moving out to his sides. Visible and unthreatening. He knew how this looked. A lone young black man in a mostly empty street. He knew. Too well. That appearances could be everything. "Hey! You there!" Turner's voice broke the silence, cutting through the night with an edge that felt sharp and accusing. Jalen stopped. His mind racing for the right words. The right posture. "Yes. Sir?" Turner eyed him. His gaze heavy with suspicion. "You in a hurry or something?" Jalen forced himself to smile. A polite, careful smile that he'd learned over years of navigating moments like these. "No, sir. Just on my way home." "On your way home?" Turner's voice carried a tone that made it sound like an accusation. "You know it's late. Right? Not exactly safe for someone like you to be wandering around." Jalen felt the jab but held his ground. "Yes. Sir. I understand." Turner's lips twisted into a smirk. "You understand, huh?" He looked at Jalen's face. His clothes. As if searching for some clue. Some excuse to confirm whatever unspoken suspicion simmered in his mind. "I saw you cross that street back there," he added. His voice calm but laced with tension. "Did you miss the crosswalk? Or do you just not care about the law?" It took a moment for Jalen to realize what Turner was talking about. He had crossed the street a few paces away from the corner, mindful to check for cars. But jaywalking? This was what he was being stopped for? "My apologies, officer," Jalen said, keeping his tone even. Respectful. "I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to?" Turner cut him off. His voice louder now. A hint of aggression creeping in. "So what were you doing then?" "Huh? Trying to sneak off somewhere?" Jalen's face fell. But he forced himself to stay composed. He'd done this dance before. He knew better than to argue. "No, sir," he said, swallowing down the indignation rising in his chest. "I'm just walking home." But his measured response only seemed to fan the flames in Turner's eyes. The officer's gaze hardened, his lips curling into a cold smile. "Got ID?" Jalen felt a pang of frustration. He knew he was within his rights to ask why they needed it. To ask if he'd done anything wrong. But he also knew the risks of asking questions. Of standing up too tall in a moment like this. With a deep breath, he reached for his wallet, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Pulling out his ID. Turner snatched it from his hand, scanning it with an air of disdain. Behind him, Reed shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking between his partner and Jalen. An uncertain look crossing his face. Reed didn't speak, didn't intervene. But the hesitation was there. A small crack in the wall of authority they represented. "Jalen Adams." Turner read aloud, his voice dripping with mock seriousness. As if the name itself was a crime. "You got any priors?" "Jalen? Anything I should know about?" Jalen shook his head. His jaw clenched. "No, sir." Turner tossed the ID back to him, his gaze never softening. "Well, maybe we should do a quick check. Make sure you're clean." Jalen held his breath, feeling his pulse throb in his temples. He wanted to say something. To explain. To ask what exactly he'd done to deserve this treatment. But he kept his mouth shut, hoping the silence would appease Turner. Would make him realize this wasn't worth his time. But Turner had no intention of letting it go. "You think you're smart? Huh?" His voice lowered. Almost a whisper. "Walking around like you own the place." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Jalen felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. Felt his shoulders tense. But he forced himself to stay calm. To stay collected. "I'm just trying to get home." "Officer," he replied. His voice steady but strained. Turner's gaze flicked over Jalen's face. Searching. Probing. As if he could find some secret hidden in his eyes. And then, with a suddenness that caught Jalen off guard, Turner stepped forward, reaching out to grab his shoulder. The contact was rough. Forceful. And it sent a jolt of shock through him. "Hands on the hood," Turner ordered, his voice cold and commanding. Jalen stumbled. The metal of the cruiser pressing into his cheek. The streetlight casting his shadow against the ground in sharp relief. "Wait, I didn't do anything," he managed. His voice muffled. A tremor creeping into his tone. But his words fell on deaf ears. "Hands behind your back," Turner growled, twisting Jalen's arms with an almost brutal efficiency. Jalen gritted his teeth, biting back a wince as the cold cuffs closed around his wrists. He felt his heart pound. Felt the humiliation settle deep inside him. Behind Turner, Reed stood. His face pale. His hands fidgeting at his sides. He opened his mouth as if to speak. As if to suggest that maybe they were going too far. But no words came. The weight of protocol, of loyalty to his partner, kept him silent. Turner shoved Jalen into the back of the cruiser, slamming the door shut with a finality that echoed down the empty street. As they pulled away, Jalen sat in the back seat, his mind racing, his heart a drumbeat of anger and disbelief. He felt bruised, his dignity shattered. Yet he knew this wasn't over. As the cruiser sped through the sleeping city, Jalen's mind lingered on one thing: his father. The man who had spent his life in the same uniform these officers wore. A man who believed in justice, in the strength of the law. But right now, justice felt like a distant concept, hollow and unreachable. The officers in the front had no idea who they had just arrested. No idea of the storm that would follow their actions. And as Jalen stared out the window, the city lights blurring past, a fierce resolve began to grow in him. This time, he wouldn't stay silent. This time, he would be heard. The morning light crept slowly through the city, painting the rooftops and streets in shades of soft gold. Inside the police station, a charged silence hovered, broken only by the occasional murmur of officers going about their routines. But the atmosphere felt different, weighed down by an unspoken tension that clung to every corner, every glance exchanged between the officers. At the center of it all was Jalen Adams, sitting on a hard plastic bench in the holding cell, his wrists aching where the cuffs had been, his mind replaying the night's events over and over. He hadn't slept, the bruises on his face were darkening, a reminder of his silent rage and powerlessness. But as the hours had passed, that rage had begun to simmer into something sharper, something steady. He knew his father would come. It was only a matter of time. A door opened down the hallway, and heavy footsteps echoed through the station, filling the space with a quiet intensity that made the officers instinctively stand a little straighter, their eyes following the sound. Chief Leroy Adams had arrived. Leroy Adams was a figure of quiet authority in the city, a black man who had worked his way up through the ranks, earning respect through years of dedication, integrity, and grit. His presence commanded attention. His gaze, usually calm and steady, had the weight of experience behind it. But today, his face was drawn, his expression colder than anyone had ever seen. As he strode past the officers, they fell silent, feeling the chill that clung to his steps. He walked directly to the holding cell, his eyes fixed on his son. The sight of Jalen, bruised and weary, behind bars in his own department. Hit him harder than he'd anticipated. For a moment, the professional mask cracked, and a flash of raw anger flickered in his eyes. But he swallowed it down, keeping his voice steady. "Jalen," he said quietly. Jalen looked up, and in his father's gaze, he saw the shock, the pain. But he also saw something else, a fierce resolve. He rose slowly, his eyes meeting his father's with a mixture of relief and defiance. "Dad," he murmured, his voice rough. Leroy nodded, his face unreadable as he turned to the officer standing by the door. "Open it." The officer, caught off guard by the command, fumbled for the keys. As the door clicked open, Jalen stepped forward, out of the cell, standing beside his father. For a brief moment, they were just a father and son, sharing a silence thick with unspoken words. But as they walked down the hall toward Leroy's office, the reality of the situation settled heavily between them. Inside the office, Leroy closed the door, gesturing for Jalen to sit. The room was dimly lit, papers and files stacked neatly on the desk. Reminders of the years Leroy had spent working for justice in a system he'd tried to believe in. But this, seeing his own son treated like a criminal, shook his faith. "Tell me what happened," he said, his voice low, controlled. Jalen took a deep breath, recounting the events of the previous night. The way Turner had cornered him, the mocking tone, the unwarranted aggression. As he spoke, Leroy's hands clenched, the knuckles turning white. But he said nothing, letting his son finish, absorbing every word. When Jalen finally fell silent, Leroy closed his eyes, his shoulders tense. This was his son, his own blood, treated as if he were nothing. As if his life, his dignity, didn't matter. And the men who had done this, they were his own officers. Men he'd trusted. Men he'd believed understood what it meant to serve and protect. Without a word, Leroy stood and left the office, his face a mask of cold determination as he made his way to the briefing room where Turner and Reed were waiting. Both officers straightened as he entered. But there was a noticeable shift in the air, a quiet realization of who they had just crossed. "Turner. Reed," Leroy said, his voice as sharp as a blade, cutting through the silence. "Care to explain what happened last night?" Turner stiffened, his eyes meeting Leroy's with a defensive glint. "Chief, we were just doing our job." The suspect was acting suspiciously. "We stopped him for jaywalking, but he gave us attitude. So we had to keep control of the situation." "Control?" Leroy's voice dropped. "Cold and dangerous. Control? Is that what you call putting an unarmed young man, my son, in a cell after beating him down for walking home?" Reed shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. He'd spent the night replaying the incident, each moment gnawing at his conscience. Now, faced with Leroy's fierce gaze, he felt the shame settle deeper, eating away at whatever justifications he'd clung to. "Chief, Reed started. But his voice faltered, the words drying up in his throat. Leroy's eyes flicked to him, catching the guilt in his expression. "Reed," he said, softer now, his tone demanding honesty. "Is that what happened?" Reed hesitated, the silence stretching unbearably. But then, with a deep breath, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Chief, I didn't feel right about it. Turner said we needed to keep control, that we couldn't let him walk all over us. I thought," he swallowed, struggling with the words. "I thought it was just procedure. But I knew it was wrong." Turner's eyes widened, a flash of betrayal crossing his face. "Reed. What are you doing?" he hissed. His voice low. Seething. But Reed couldn't hold it in any longer. The guilt had festered. Grown until it felt like a weight crushing his chest. He was just a kid. Turner. He wasn't a threat. We didn't need to treat him like that. Leroy's gaze returned to Turner. Colder than ice. "It's people like you, Turner, who make the public question everything we stand for. Did you even stop to think? Did you even care?" Turner opened his mouth. But no words came out. In the depth of Leroy's gaze, he saw his own reflection, a man hardened by years on the force. Convinced he was always in the right. But now, faced with the consequences, he felt a crack in his armor. A crack that went deeper than he wanted to admit. Leroy took a step back. His gaze sweeping over both officers. His voice calm but unyielding. "You're both suspended. Effective immediately. There will be a full investigation. And Turner," he added, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone, "if I ever catch you disrespecting another young man like that, especially one who's done nothing wrong, I'll make sure you never wear a badge again. Do you understand?" Turner swallowed. His face ashen. "Yes, Chief," he muttered. The weight of Leroy's words sinking in. Final and unarguable. With one last look, Leroy turned and left the room. His heart pounding. But even as he returned to his office, even as he saw Jalen waiting for him, he knew that his fight was only beginning. This wasn't just about his son, it was about the entire system. About the changes that had to be made. Changes he could no longer ignore. As he sat beside Jalen, a heavy silence hung between them. But in that silence was an understanding. A bond that would drive them both forward. Leroy knew he would fight for his son. For his community. And for every young man like Jalen who had been made to feel powerless. The story of this incident, he realized, was just beginning. The early morning light seeped into the police station, casting a soft, golden glow that felt at odds with the tension thickening the air. Officers glanced at each other uneasily. Whispers passing between them like gusts of wind. They knew something had happened. Something serious enough to rattle even Chief Leroy Adams. A man as steady and composed as they came. And now he was here. His face a mask of cold fury as he walked through the station with purpose. As Leroy made his way to the holding cell, he could feel the weight of each step. The simmering anger blending with a deeper, more painful realization. The system he'd dedicated his life to, the badge he'd worn with pride, had betrayed his own son. The very officers he'd trusted had reduced Jalen to a nameless figure. A statistic in the system Leroy had worked tirelessly to make fair and just. He reached the holding cell. And there, sitting on the hard, cold bench with his head held high despite his bruises, was Jalen. In that moment, Leroy's heart twisted. Jalen was so young, so full of potential. And yet, here he was, treated as though he was nothing more than a suspect. An inconvenience. For a fleeting moment, Leroy felt powerless. A father unable to shield his son from the harsh reality of a world he knew all too well. "Jalen," he said, his voice soft yet carrying the weight of his hurt and anger. Jalen looked up. The fatigue in his eyes momentarily replaced by relief. But beneath that relief lay something darker, a spark of defiance. An anger Leroy had never seen in his son before. It was as if a door had been opened inside Jalen, revealing a side that could no longer accept silence and submission. "Dad," Jalen murmured, his voice raw with exhaustion. Leroy nodded to the officer standing nearby. "Unlock it," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officer quickly complied. the door opening with a heavy metallic clang. Jalen stepped forward, rubbing his sore wrists as he looked at his father, the unspoken questions hanging between them. As they walked down the hallway toward Leroy's office, Jalen's mind swirled with a chaotic mix of relief, resentment, and questions he wasn't sure he could even voice. He had always admired his father, the man who had taught him the importance of honesty, dignity, and respect. But now, seeing the cracks in his father's system, he felt an anger that went beyond the bruises on his skin. Inside the office, Leroy gestured for Jalen to sit. He took a seat across from his son, studying the bruises darkening on Jalen's cheek, the fatigue lining his face. For the first time, Leroy felt the weight of his position, not as a chief, but as a father. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken words. "Tell me what happened," Leroy said, his voice steady but laced with a sorrow he struggled to conceal. Jalen hesitated, glancing down at his hands. Part of him didn't want to relive the incident, didn't want to see the pain in his father's eyes as he recounted the details. But he knew this conversation had to happen. He took a deep breath and began, his voice a low murmur as he recounted each moment, the stop, the accusations, the way Turner's voice had dripped with disdain, the brutal treatment he'd endured for a minor infraction. As he spoke, Leroy listened in silence, his expression unreadable. But beneath the calm exterior, a storm raged. Each word felt like a wound, each detail a reminder of how the very system he'd upheld had failed his own son. By the time Jalen finished, Leroy's hands were clenched tightly on his desk, his jaw set in a hard line. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying a steely edge. "This shouldn't have happened to you, Jalen. Not to you. Not to anyone." His gaze softened slightly as he looked at his son. "But I'm going to make this right." Jalen met his father's eyes, a flicker of hope breaking through the anger. He nodded, feeling a sense of comfort in his father's resolve. But even as Leroy's words offered reassurance, Jalen knew this was only the beginning. Leaving Jalen in his office, Leroy made his way to the briefing room, where Turner and Reed sat waiting. Turner lounged back in his chair, arms crossed, his face a mask of confidence, while Reed sat rigidly beside him, his expression tense, eyes darting to the floor. As Leroy entered, both men stood, but the room's atmosphere shifted, a tension crackling in the air like a live wire. Leroy's gaze swept over both officers, and for a moment, he allowed his silence to speak for him. Turner's smirk faded slightly, his stance growing more rigid as the weight of Leroy's presence settled over him. "Turner. Reed," Leroy began, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I want to know exactly what happened last night. And I want the truth." Turner straightened, his expression turning defensive. "Chief, we were doing our job. The suspect was being difficult, resisting us. We couldn't risk losing control of the situation." He crossed his arms, a defiant glint in his eyes. "Respectfully, sir, we were just following protocol." Leroy's gaze didn't waver, his expression hardening. "Protocol," he repeated, his voice dangerously calm. "Is that what you think it was, Turner? Beating an unarmed young man, my son, no less, for walking home?" Turner's face paled slightly, the reality of his actions finally beginning to sink in. He glanced at Reed, hoping for some silent support. But Reed's face was a mask of guilt, his shoulders tense as he stared at the ground. "Reed?" Leroy's voice softened slightly, though his tone held an edge that demanded honesty. Is that what happened? Reed's hands fidgeted in his lap. His face flushed with shame. He took a deep breath. And when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Chief. He paused, gathering his courage. It didn't feel right. I knew it was wrong. But Turner said we needed to keep control. That we couldn't let him walk all over us. Turner's eyes flashed with anger. His voice a low hiss. Reed. What are you doing? But Reed couldn't hold it in any longer. The guilt, the shame, had grown too heavy to bear. He was just a kid. Turner, he said. His voice stronger now, though his hands still trembled. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't doing anything wrong. And we treated him like he was nothing. Leroy's eyes never left Turner. His gaze cold and unyielding. You've just heard it from your own partner. Turner. Do you still think you were just following protocol? Turner's shoulders slumped. His defiance crumbling under the weight of Leroy's words and Reed's confession. In that moment, he saw himself through Leroy's eyes, a man blinded by his own authority. A man who had crossed a line he could never uncross. After a long silence, Leroy spoke. His voice low and unshakable. Both of you are suspended. Effective immediately. There will be a full investigation. And if I find that you've broken the trust of this department, I'll make sure you never wear a badge again. Do you understand? Turner swallowed hard. Nodding. The realization of his actions settling in his stomach like lead. Reed looked down. The relief mingling with regret. Knowing that while he had finally told the truth, it came too late. Without another word, Leroy turned and left the room. His mind already on the next steps he would need to take. He knew that suspending Turner and Reed was only the beginning, that there were deeper issues in the department. Issues he could no longer ignore. And for the first time, he felt the full weight of his responsibility. Not just as a chief, but as a father, a leader, and a man who had the power to make real, lasting change. Returning to his office, he found Jalen waiting. His expression guarded but hopeful. Leroy sat beside him. His heart heavy yet resolute. The path ahead would be difficult, filled with resistance and hard truths. But he was ready. This wasn't just about his son. It was about every young man. Every person who had been made to feel invisible, powerless. Leroy would fight for them. And he knew Jalen would be beside him, ready to challenge the very system he had once believed in. For Leroy, this revelation had changed everything. And as he looked into his son's eyes, he knew they were no longer alone. The suspension of Turner and Reed rippled through the department. A shockwave that forced everyone to confront the deeper issues simmering beneath the surface. Some officers questioned Leroy's decision, quietly murmuring about loyalty and solidarity, while others welcomed the change, seeing it as a necessary step toward accountability. Leroy knew that he was at the heart of a storm, standing at a crossroads between tradition and justice, between his duty as a chief and his duty as a father. Days passed, and with each one, Leroy wrestled with the weight of his choices. He knew that holding Turner and Reed accountable was only the beginning. For true change, he needed to address the systemic issues within the department, to confront the quiet biases, the unchecked power that had allowed such an incident to occur in the first place. Meanwhile, Jalen tried to return to a semblance of normalcy. But the scars, both physical and emotional, ran deep. Everywhere he went, he felt the invisible eyes, the subtle whispers. Friends and family reached out, offering support. But he felt a growing anger inside him, a burning desire to speak out, to make sure that what happened to him wouldn't happen to anyone else. He found himself grappling with questions he'd never thought he'd have to answer. How could he reconcile his father's dedication to the police with his own experience of brutality at their hands? Could he trust a system that had turned on him so easily? One evening, Leroy found Jalen sitting on the back porch, staring up at the stars. He approached quietly, sensing his son's turmoil. They hadn't spoken much about the incident since that day in the station, both of them grappling with their own pain and questions. But tonight, Leroy knew he had to reach out, to bridge the gap that had grown between them. "Mind if I sit?" Leroy asked, his voice soft, almost hesitant. Jalen looked up, his expression guarded but not unkind. "Sure, Dad," he murmured, shifting slightly to make room. They sat in silence for a few moments, the quiet night air wrapping around them. Leroy took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the stars above, the weight of his words heavy in his chest. "Jalen," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I can't change what happened. And I know that saying sorry isn't enough. But I want you to know that I'm going to do everything in my power to make things right. Not just for you, but for everyone who's been wronged by this system." Jalen looked down, his fingers tracing patterns in the wood of the porch. "I appreciate that, Dad," he replied, his voice steady but laced with a quiet pain. "But it's hard. You know? I've seen what you've dedicated your life to, and I've always respected it. But after what happened," he trailed off, the words caught in his throat. "I just don't know if I can see it the same way anymore." Leroy nodded, his heart heavy. "I understand, son. I know it's hard to trust a system that's hurt you. But that's why I need your help. I need your voice, your perspective, to make real change." They shared a long, silent look, an unspoken understanding passing between them. In that moment, Jalen felt a flicker of hope, a tentative but genuine belief that perhaps, together, they could make a difference. Over the following weeks, Leroy took steps to initiate reforms within the department. He organized mandatory training sessions on bias and community relations, invited community leaders and activists to speak at the station, and began reviewing protocols that allowed unchecked power to go unnoticed. It wasn't an easy process. Some officers resisted, others resented the changes, but Leroy pressed forward, knowing that real change was never easy. Turner and Reed's suspension had sent a clear message, but the consequences were far from over. Leroy arranged a meeting between Jalen, Turner, and Reed, a difficult but necessary confrontation that he hoped would provide a path toward healing and understanding. The meeting was held in a small conference room at the station. Jalen sat on one side of the table, his expression calm but wary. Across from him, Reed fidgeted nervously, his eyes darting to the floor, while Turner sat stiffly, his face a mask of defiance. Though his usual confidence had faded, Leroy stood nearby, observing silently, ready to intervene if needed but hoping the men could find a way to speak honestly. After a long, tense silence, Reed cleared his throat, looking up at Jalen with a mixture of guilt and determination. "Jalen," he began, his voice quiet but sincere. I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I knew it then. And I know it even more now. What we did to you, it was wrong. And I'll never forgive myself for letting it happen." Jalen listened, his expression unreadable. He wanted to believe Reed's apology, but a part of him still bristled with anger, with the memory of the cold metal cuffs, the pain, the humiliation. Turner shifted in his seat, his face hardening. "Look, kid," he said, his voice rough. "I'm not going to lie. I thought I was doing my job. I've been on this force for a long time. And I've seen things you wouldn't believe. But that doesn't excuse what I did. I was wrong. I see that now. Jalen met Turner's gaze, searching his eyes for any hint of sincerity. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching painfully. But finally, Jalen spoke, his voice steady, unwavering. I appreciate the apology, he said, his tone calm but firm. But this isn't just about me. It's about every young black man who's been treated like a threat for just existing. It's about a system that lets this happen over and over. If you're really sorry, then show it. Prove it by changing. By speaking up when you see this happening to someone else. Reed nodded, his face pale but resolute. I will. I promise. Turner hesitated. But after a moment, he nodded as well. A flicker of understanding in his eyes. I'll try, he murmured. The words barely audible. I know it's not enough. But I'll try. Leroy watched the exchange, his heart filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He knew that healing would be a long and painful journey. But this moment, this simple act of honesty, was a step forward. In the months that followed, the changes Leroy had set in motion began to take root. Turner and Reed were required to participate in community service and bias training, a condition of their reinstatement that Leroy insisted upon. Jalen, too, found himself stepping into a new role, speaking at local schools and community centers, sharing his story, using his voice to advocate for justice and change. Slowly, the city began to shift. The police department's relationship with the community strengthened. Bridges of trust rebuilt, one conversation, one apology, one act of kindness at a time. Leroy and Jalen worked together. Father and son united in a shared mission. Each of them changed by the ordeal but strengthened by it as well. And as Jalen stood before a crowd one evening, sharing his story with young men who looked up at him with a mixture of admiration and hope, he felt a quiet sense of pride. A feeling that perhaps, despite everything, he could make a difference. The pain, the anger, it would always be there. A reminder of what he had endured. But now, he carried it with purpose. With resilience. Leroy watched from the back of the crowd, his heart swelling with pride. His son had become a voice for change, a beacon of hope in a world that often felt dark and unforgiving. And as the crowd erupted in applause, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that together, they had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, determined to build a future defined not by fear and prejudice, but by justice, understanding, and hope. The days following the meeting in the conference room were uneasy for everyone. Reed found himself restless, his thoughts tangled with guilt and the faces of the young people in his community who might look at him differently now. He hadn't joined the force to become the very type of officer he once feared. He spent late nights sitting alone, his mind replaying the hurt in Jalen's eyes, wondering how he could prove his remorse. Apologies felt shallow without action, and he knew that it would take more than words to restore the trust he had broken. Turner, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile his actions with the man he'd always believed himself to be. His pride and defensiveness clashed with the shame he felt but had trouble admitting, even to himself. After years of being celebrated as a hard-hitting officer, it was a strange, humbling experience to realize he might have been wrong. Every morning, he woke with a heavy reminder of his mistakes. But the idea of taking real steps to change felt daunting. Leroy saw the challenges his officers faced, though he had taken firm action against them. He knew the path to genuine accountability was complex and fraught with doubt. Part of him wanted to guide Turner and Reed, but he also recognized that the journey had to be their own. They needed to seek understanding, to feel the pain and discomfort that would lead to growth. Over the next few weeks, with Leroy's insistence, the department held more training sessions, focusing on community relations, accountability, and bias awareness. Reed attended each session with a new sense of urgency. He listened carefully, absorbing the stories of those who had felt the sting of injustice. And gradually, he began to understand. He volunteered to join community events, often standing in the background, watching and learning, grateful for any opportunity to rebuild the trust he had lost. One evening, after a training session, Reed approached Leroy as he was leaving the station. "Chief, I just wanted to say, thank you for not giving up on me," he said. His voice tinged with regret but laced with newfound determination. Leroy looked at him, his gaze steady. "Reed, I'm not here to punish you," he replied. "But you need to understand the weight of what we carry as officers. Every decision, every action, it reflects on this badge and on the people we serve." Reed nodded, feeling the weight of Leroy's words sink deep. "I do, Chief. I'm working on it. I'll prove that I can do better." Leroy placed a firm hand on Reed's shoulder, a sign of cautious trust. "Then let your actions speak. Reed, the community needs to see that you mean it." As Reed left, he felt something shift inside him, a purpose beyond his role. A desire to become the officer he'd once envisioned. A protector and a servant to his community. For Jalen, the healing process. In the months that followed, Jalen channeled his experiences into advocacy. Invited to local schools, he shared his story with young people, offering them a sense of validation, a reminder that their voices mattered. He spoke candidly about the trauma he'd endured, the vulnerability of being reduced to a suspect, and the importance of resilience. With every speech, he felt his own strength grow, his pain transforming into purpose. One evening, after a community meeting, he was approached by an older gentleman who looked at him with a mix of admiration and sadness. "Son," the man said, his voice soft yet firm, "I've seen things in this city that would make a man lose faith. But you, standing here, speaking your truth, you give me hope. Don't let that fire go out." Jalen felt a warmth spread through him, a reassurance he hadn't realized he needed. "Thank you, sir," he replied, his voice steady. "I won't." As he returned home that night, Jalen thought of his father, the man who had shaped his understanding of justice. Despite everything, Leroy had stood by him, believed in him, and used his position to make things right. For Jalen, this was more than just an act of love, it was a testament to his father's strength and integrity. Turner's journey. Turner's path was far more challenging. The confrontation with Leroy had left him questioning everything he once took for granted. He began attending counseling sessions, organized by Leroy as part of the department's reform initiatives. Though at first he resisted, thinking them unnecessary. But gradually, as he heard stories of community members who had been unfairly targeted, he began to recognize the human faces behind the statistics, the real lives that could be impacted by a single choice. One afternoon, he found himself sitting alone in the station, going through old case files. Each report was a reminder of the people he had encountered over the years. The moments he'd perhaps acted too quickly, too harshly. A particular file stood out, a young man he detained several years ago for loitering. Reading it now, he could see the prejudice that had colored his actions, an unspoken bias that had clouded his judgment. He closed the file, his hands shaking slightly. For the first time, Turner saw himself with clarity. realizing that the years he'd spent priding himself on his tough approach had blinded him to his own faults. Driven by a growing sense of responsibility, Turner began volunteering at a local youth center, hoping to mend his connection with the community. Though hesitant at first, he found that listening to the stories of young people, understanding their fears and struggles, gave him a new perspective. Slowly, he felt himself changing, his heart softening in ways he hadn't thought possible. Epilogue: a new beginning. Months turned into a year, and the city had changed. Leroy's reforms had taken root, and the department had begun to repair its relationship with the community. It wasn't perfect, change never was, but it was progress. Leroy watched with pride as his department adapted, as officers like Reed and, to his surprise, even Turner, grew into their roles with a renewed sense of purpose and accountability. One warm evening, the city held a community gathering at a local park. There were families, children playing, food stalls lining the streets, and a stage set up for speakers and performers. Leroy stood near the back, watching as people mingled, laughter and music filling the air. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that this gathering, this harmony, was something he and his team had worked hard to nurture. Jalen took the stage, the crowd falling silent as he stepped up to the microphone. His eyes scanned the faces before him, filled with friends, neighbors, and strangers who had come to support a shared vision of unity and justice. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Jalen began, his voice resonating with strength and conviction. "This isn't just about me, or my family, or even our police department. This is about all of us, standing together, committed to a future where justice isn't just a word, but a reality for every person in our community." The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of appreciation and solidarity that filled the air with hope. As Jalen stepped down, he spotted Turner in the crowd, standing with a group of young people from the youth center. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Turner nodded, a silent acknowledgement of respect. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a step forward, a symbol of the possibility of change. Reed approached Jalen after the event, his expression earnest. "Jalen, I just want to say, I'm proud of you. I'm trying to be better, too," he said, his voice full of sincerity. Jalen smiled, the weight of their shared history lightening, if only slightly. "Thank you, Reed. I believe you." Leroy watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride for both his son and his officers. They had all traveled a hard, painful road. But now, standing amidst the people they served, he felt a profound sense of peace. For Leroy, this was the culmination of his life's work, a community united, resilient, and hopeful. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a warm, golden glow, Leroy wrapped an arm around Jalen's shoulders. They stood together, father and son, knowing that the journey was far from over, but ready to face it together. And in that moment, amidst the laughter, the applause, and the soft murmurs of hope, they felt something rare and powerful, a glimpse of a future defined not by fear or prejudice, but by justice, compassion, and an unwavering belief in the power of change. A year had passed since that fateful night, and the city had come to feel like a different place. The air buzzed with a newfound sense of unity and respect that stretched from City Hall to the neighborhoods, to every corner where the echoes of past injustices still lingered. For the first time, Jalen saw the police as more than just authority figures. They were people, members of his community who shared his goals and dreams. Though the scars of his experience had not fully healed, He felt hopeful and eager to contribute to the city's growth. The impact of Leroy's reforms had reached far beyond the department. Community programs now bridge the gap between officers and civilians, giving people a voice in shaping the future of public safety. Regular forums allowed community members to openly discuss their experiences with law enforcement, while officers attended, listened, and worked to understand and address their concerns. Jalen's role as a community leader. Jalen, now a well-respected voice in the city, was invited to sit on the Community Advisory Board, where he represented the younger generation's perspective. His insights were invaluable, and his presence served as a reminder to the department of their responsibility to protect and serve all citizens equally. He had become not only a symbol of resilience but also a bridge between the police and the people. During one of the advisory board's meetings, Jalen found himself sitting beside Turner. The former adversaries exchanged a brief, quiet nod of acknowledgement, neither warm nor hostile, but respectful. The distance between them had lessened over time, marked by Turner's efforts in the community and Jalen's growing understanding that change, though difficult, was possible. As the meeting proceeded, Turner spoke up, his voice steady but filled with a vulnerability he'd learned to embrace over the past year. "I'm here today because I know I made mistakes," he said, his gaze fixed on the faces around the room. "I've worked hard to become better, to be someone who's part of the solution instead of the problem. I'll carry the responsibility of my actions for the rest of my life. And all I can do now is try to make it right." The room fell silent, each person absorbing the weight of Turner's words. For Jalen, it was a moment of vindication. He had demanded change, and Turner's journey was proof that his efforts, and his pain, had not been in vain. After the meeting, Turner approached Jalen, shifting awkwardly as he gathered his words. "Jalen, I know we may never be friends, but I want you to know that I respect what you're doing. You're doing something powerful. And it's changed me. It's changed all of us." Jalen studied Turner for a long moment, letting the words sink in. The resentment he had once felt had softened over time, replaced by a cautious sense of closure. "Thank you, Turner," he replied, his voice calm. "That means a lot. What matters to me is that you're here, that you're trying. And I think that's all anyone can ask for." The first annual Unity Day event. In a show of solidarity, the city decided to host an event called Unity Day, a celebration dedicated to fostering connections and promoting understanding between the police department and the community. Leroy had worked tirelessly to bring the event to life, believing it would be a step toward lasting peace. The event was held at the city's largest park, where booths, activities, and food stalls lined the pathways. Officers and civilians mingled, sharing stories and laughter, their conversations a testament to the progress they'd made together. Jalen and Leroy stood side by side, watching the city come alive in a way they had once only dreamed of. "This feels like a new beginning, doesn't it?" Jalen murmured, his voice filled with awe. Leroy smiled, a quiet pride shining in his eyes. "It does. But remember, son, this is only the beginning. True change takes time and commitment. It's something we have to work for every day." The mayor approached them, greeting them both warmly. "Leroy, Jalen, this event wouldn't have been possible without your hard work and dedication. You both have inspired something truly incredible here." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the crowd, Jalen took the stage. He looked out at the faces before him, each one a reminder of why he had chosen this path. He felt the weight of the moment, the understanding that his words could shape the future of his city. "Thank you all for being here today," Jalen began, his voice carrying across the crowd. This event isn't just about celebrating what we've achieved, it's a reminder of the work that still lies ahead. We've come together, despite our differences. And we've shown that unity is possible. Let's keep pushing. Keep striving to create a community that is safe, fair, and just for everyone. The crowd erupted into applause, their faces shining with hope and gratitude. Leroy watched with a proud smile as Jalen spoke, knowing that his son had become a symbol of resilience and strength. A voice for the voiceless. A moment of reconciliation. As the event wound down, Jalen wandered toward the edge of the park, needing a moment to himself. He found a quiet spot under a tree, taking in the peaceful sounds of laughter and music drifting through the air. Reed, who had been volunteering at one of the booths, noticed him and approached quietly. "Hey, Jalen," Reed said, his voice hesitant. "Mind if I sit?" Jalen nodded, gesturing to the spot beside him. They sat in silence for a while, both of them reflecting on the past year and the journey that had brought them to this moment. "I owe you an apology," Reed said softly, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Not just for that night, but for every moment I stayed silent when I knew things were wrong. I didn't stand up when I should have. And that's something I'll always regret." Jalen looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "Reed, I've come to understand that change is hard. It takes courage to face our own mistakes. The fact that you're here, trying to make things right, that matters to me." Reed nodded, relief softening his expression. "Thank you, Jalen, for giving me a chance to do better." They sat quietly, side by side. No longer adversaries, but two people bound by a shared commitment to a brighter future. In that moment, Jalen realized that forgiveness didn't erase the pain, but it allowed room for healing, for growth. A community united. As night fell, Leroy gathered everyone for a candlelight vigil to honor those who had been impacted by injustice, both in the city and beyond. The crowd gathered, holding candles that glowed softly in the darkness, their collective presence a powerful reminder of resilience. Jalen stood beside his father, both of them holding candles, their faces illuminated by the gentle light. Turner and Reed stood nearby, their expressions solemn, each man carrying the weight of his own journey. Together, they listened as Leroy spoke, his voice steady, carrying a message of hope and perseverance. "This is our city," Leroy said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "A place where every life matters, where every voice is heard. We've come a long way, but our work isn't done. Let this moment remind us that change begins with each of us. That together, we can create a future defined by respect, unity, and justice." The crowd raised their candles, the soft light growing stronger as they stood together, united in purpose. Jalen looked around, feeling the energy, the connection that pulsed through the crowd. This was more than just a gathering, it was a promise. A commitment to keep moving forward, no matter the obstacles. For the first time in his life, Jalen felt a deep, unwavering sense of hope. He had found his place in the city, his voice a beacon that would continue to guide others, inspiring them to rise above fear and prejudice. And as he looked out over the crowd, his father by his side, Jalen knew that they had forged something powerful and lasting. Together, they had turned pain into progress, transforming their city into a place where justice was not a distant ideal, but a lived reality. As the candles flickered softly in the night, Jalen felt at peace, knowing that he and his community would continue to stand together, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Epilogue: Legacy of Change. Years later, Jalen's impact was felt throughout the city. His story passed down as a testament to the power of resilience and unity. His work inspired new generations, and the department became a model of reform and community engagement. Leroy, retired but active in advocacy, would often sit at community events, watching young leaders rise and carry forward the torch he and Jalen had lit together. His heart filled with pride as he watched his son's legacy blossom, knowing that the city had become a place of hope, not just for them, but for everyone. Jalen's journey, and the journeys of those around him, became a powerful reminder that change was possible, that unity could overcome division, and that justice, though hard won, was a prize worth fighting for. And as the city flourished, the memory of that first Unity Day celebration lived on. A day when a community had come together, transforming darkness into light, and paving the way for a brighter, more compassionate world. Years had passed since that pivotal night that had changed Jalen's life and the heartbeat of his city. The journey had not been easy, but the city had come to stand as a symbol of transformation, a place where the hard-won battle for justice and unity resonated through each street, every neighborhood, and in the hearts of those who called it home. Jalen had grown into a respected community leader, known not only within the city but across the state. His voice carried weight, his words inspiring communities far beyond the one that had first known his story. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the progress they had fought for was not lost. But as he looked around, he saw that this fight, this commitment to justice, was no longer his alone. His story had sparked countless others, a movement that grew with each new voice added to it. On the eve of the 5th anniversary of Unity Day, the city came together to honor the legacy of change they had built. The park was alive with laughter, with families, neighbors, and friends gathering to celebrate. Lanterns hung from trees, casting a warm, inviting glow as music played, and the familiar sounds of people mingling filled the air. Children ran past, their laughter a joyful reminder of the brighter future everyone was working toward. Jalen stood near the stage, watching as people arrived, their faces filled with excitement and anticipation. He thought of his father, of the quiet strength and dedication Leroy had shown him over the years. For Jalen, his father had been more than a mentor, he had been a guiding light, a reminder that justice was something one had to create, to protect, and to pass on. Leroy, now retired but just as engaged in community work as ever, stood by his side, his face lined with years but softened by a deep, enduring pride. He looked at Jalen with a warmth that spoke of love, respect, and an unbreakable bond they had forged together. "I'm proud of you, son," Leroy said, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "What you've accomplished here, what you've helped the city become, it's more than I could have ever dreamed." Jalen looked back at his father, feeling the weight of his words, the legacy they shared. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad," he replied, a soft smile on his face. "You showed me the way. You believed in me when I didn't even know if I could believe in myself." They shared a moment of silence, their hearts full, watching the people gather, a beautiful reminder of how far they had come. Then, as the crowd settled, Jalen took the stage, looking out at the sea of faces, each one a part of the city's story, each one a testament to their shared journey. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Jalen began, his voice carrying over the crowd, filled with a quiet strength. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the progress we've made, but the future we're building together. We are more than a city. We're a community, a family. And I am endlessly proud to be a part of that." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We've learned that real change takes time. that it requires us to work together, to lift each other up. There's still work to do. But standing here tonight, I know that we can face it together. As Jalen spoke, he noticed familiar faces in the crowd. Reed, who now led the department's community outreach programs, dedicated to bridging the gap he had once contributed to. Turner, who had retired from the force but continued volunteering, his presence a quiet reminder of the power of redemption. Both men nodded at him, their expressions humble, grateful for the second chance they had been given. Turning back to the crowd, Jalen concluded, "This journey doesn't end here. Every day, we choose to uphold these values, to be the example we want to set for our children, our families, and our city. Let tonight remind us that unity isn't just a word. It's a promise. And it's one I intend to keep." The crowd erupted into applause, voices cheering, a palpable energy filling the air. In that moment, Jalen felt a profound sense of peace and purpose. He had become more than just a survivor of his own painful experience. He had become a leader, a force for good that would continue shaping the future of the city he loved. Later, as the crowd began to disperse, Leroy approached Jalen, the soft glow of lanterns illuminating his proud smile. "I think it's safe to say you've made a difference, Jalen." Jalen looked at him, his heart full. "Only because you showed me how," he replied, his voice tinged with gratitude. As they stood together, father and son, they knew that the work would continue, that the city would carry on the legacy they had built. The night sky stretched out above them, vast and filled with stars, a reminder that the journey toward justice, compassion, and understanding was as infinite as the universe itself. The story of their city would continue to unfold, written by the hands of the people who called it home. And in the glow of that night, surrounded by laughter, hope, and the faces of those they loved, Jalen and Leroy knew that this was just the beginning. They had become part of something greater than themselves, a movement, a family, a community united by a shared belief in a future where everyone was valued, respected, and free. And as they walked away from the event, side by side, they carried with them a quiet, enduring truth. Together, they had made a difference. And together, they would continue to fight for a world where justice and love could flourish, leaving a legacy that would echo through generations to come.